Hi, it's me, Tim. Today I want to talk about Rags to Riches, which is the first game I made at Interplay as an employee. So the previous game I made there, Bard's Tale Construction Set, I was a contractor, so I did it all at home, and I would come in weekly for them to check the progress of what I was doing. But Rags to Riches, I got hired as an employee. This was in very early, I think it was January of 92. They had completely filled up. Interplay had filled up all their offices. So they had rented an upstairs office in the building they were in. That one was also filled up. So when I was hired, I my desk was in the I was told it was the vestibule. It was basically the hallway into the office between two producers. I had Rusty Buchert on one side, who was very stressed out. I worked at Interplay for 6 years. I don't believe I saw Rusty in an unstressed state. And Bill Dugan, very tall, lanky fellow. He was the producer, he was the producer who would eventually become producer on MacPlay. The way he introduced himself to me that day is he leaned over the cubicle wall and over top of me and just said, "Hey, I'm Bill Dugan, producer. Who the hell are you?" That was day one. So I was assigned to work on Rags to Riches under Tom Decker, who was my producer on Bard's Tale Construction Set. This is the first game that I made that was both Super VGA and the first game where I was the only coder. There were other programmers on Bard's Tale Construction Set and other ones on Grand Slime Bridge, but every line of code in Rags to Riches was my own pristine, flawless diamond C code. It also was my first Super VGA game. Super VGA was a new mode that video cards were supporting. Before that, we had VGA, which topped out at 320, 240, 256 color. Super VGA could do 640, 480, 256 color. But because the way memory mapping worked on a PC, you could only access 64K of a video screen at once. 64K was enough to do 320 by 240, but not 640, 480. In fact, you needed to memory map it into 5 regions and then bank switch between those regions. It was called bank switching. Bank switching not only had to be done in assembly language, but it was different for every single video card. And not just by brand, and not just by model within the brand, but there were video cards, I'm looking at you, Trident 9600, that came with different chipsets. They had chipset A, B, and C, and all 3 of them did bank switching in a different way. This predates VESA, which was standards for how to do Super VGA. So when the game started up, we'd ask people, "Do you know what video card you have?" Most people didn't. And even if they did, even if they like, "I remember buying a Trident 9600, they might not have known what chipset was on it. I'm not even sure that was on the box. If you looked at the card and knew which chip to look at, you could see the chipset model number with the suffix letter. So we had a way of detecting it. It wasn't 100%. So when we made the game, it was like, pick your video card off this list, or let us detect it for you. And then thankfully, right before we shipped and the VESA standards came out, I could say, if you have the VESA driver running, I'll just use that. So that was fun, and that was the first thing I had to do. It was just hard wrapping my head around it. I think Rags to Riches is the first Super VGA game that Interplay made. So I was in untested waters. The game itself was based on a board game called Speculation, made by Lee Ardrey. We would talk to him about how the board game worked, and Tom and I were trying to convert it to how a computer game would adapt to those roles. What I remember the most is I received so many design documents on napkins I may even still have one. I looked, I couldn't find it. It was a picture of Lucy Luster, and she's like, "Buy gold," and then a swear word. Um, Tom and I would go to lunch frequently. I forget why we were doing this. We were trying to find the best Caesar salad in Orange County. I don't know how that became a goal. So we would frequently have lunch together and talk about rags to riches and things I had to do. You know, like I'd be coding that morning, I'd run into problems and I'd ask Tom what to do. And sometimes he'd design right there in the restaurant. By the way, the best salad I think we found was at Marie Callender's. They had a really good Caesar salad with chicken. That was a good salad. And I believe that's where he drew the Lucy Luster napkin design document. So that's kind of how stuff worked in the 90s. And let me just tell you, I loved working on Rags to Riches. I loved being back at a game company. I loved the vibe, the feel of how everything worked. It was very vibrant. But one office next to me, there was a programmer, Mark Whittlesey. Mark was working on Lord of the Rings, The Two Towers. I was super jealous. I read The Lord of the Rings. I have reread it multiple times. I wanted that project. Imagine how surprised I was when I was talking to Mark to find out he had a degree in economics and he wanted to do Rags to Riches. So we hatched a brilliant idea. We'll go to Alan Pavlish, the executive producer, and say, hey, we're going to swap projects. Brilliant idea. We both are experienced programmers. Why not put us on the project that we are most suited for and love and are passionate about? Alan said no. I still remember the meeting. He listened to both of our arguments on why Mark wanted to be on Rags to Riches and why I wanted to be on Lord of the Rings. And he said, we can't let people work on the projects they want to. Because what if we're making a game that no one wants to make? And there was this long pause, and Mark and I kind of side-eyed each other, and then I went, okay, I'll ask, why would Interplay make a game that no one at Interplay wanted to make? And Alan was like, well, contracts and obligations. And I was like, okay, I get it. But why not just swap us? You don't have to say anything. The projects are both relatively small. No one would know. And he said, no, people would find out and it would set a bad precedent. So I finished Rags and Mark finished Two Towers. Rags shipped in late 93. That was the time I had chicken pox. I mentioned this in something else. I had a really bad bout of chicken pox. I also got strep throat on top of it. Chicken pox was so bad that year that some adults were getting it who had it as children. It was such a virulent strain. And a few adults in Orange County died of this strain. I had it really bad with strep throat. I was taking massive antibiotics. I was out for 2 weeks. Interplay got so desperate that they sent Tom's assistant producer, Fred Royal, not Fred Hatch, my assistant producer later on Fallout, but Fred Royal, to my house carrying my desktop. So I answered the door and Fred just took a step back and was like, oh my God, I looked horrible. I was covered in splotches and it was bad. And he goes, they want you to finish the game. And I was like, I can't sit up. I literally can't sit upright for more than an hour. This is not happening. So when I got back after being out for 2 weeks, and I believe Bill Dugan saw me and went, oh dear Lord, what's wrong with your face? I had to crunch for a few weeks to try to get that game out, which was very weird to crunch when you're in that state. Really nice. There was another programmer, Chris DeSalvo, who eventually did the Mac version of GNOME for Fallout, which is a whole other story. Chris actually, there was one night I did an all-nighter. Now, I'd gone to college and grad school, and I never pulled off an all-nighter there. I just always would fall asleep. I did an all-nighter at Interplay, and Chris DeSalvo hung out with me to help co-code. He was, he'd look at my code and I'm like, hey, I'm not sure what's going wrong here. And he'd go, you're missing a semicolon or something. But he just did it just to help keep me up. And I still remember that night because I remember we were coding and I looked out the window and I'm like, hey, I think the street lights brightened up. And he goes, no, that's dawn. And I realized I had stayed up all night. So the game shipped in, I think it was November of 93. And after that, they didn't have anything for me to work on. I jumped from game to game. I remember doing the critical error handler on Stone Keep, which was CD-ROMs back then. You could read data and it would give it to you, and then you could go back to read the data again. And it would say, yeah, there's no data there. It's or error. And you'd have to do it multiple times to get the data off of it. And so the critical error handler I wrote basically allowed, if it ever got an error off a CD-ROM, it tried again and again and again. And you could control it. I wrote GNOL, which was my operating system abstraction library. That's something that I have to do a whole video on. I also did a lot of installers. That's the time when I was making installers for other games, and I had to make so many of them that I eventually wrote an installer, which is a program that if you gave it the parameters for your installer would generate an installer. So I would have like producers come to me on Monday and go, I need an installer for my game and I need it by Friday. And I'd go, okay. And they'd leave and I'd be thinking, I could have it to them by lunch, but I will have it to them by Friday. And I would go back to working on my engines. And I made a voxel engine and a 3D engine and they were terrible. And I made a sprite engine and it was good. And that's what turned into Fallout. So I think it's interesting that Rags to Riches and the short period I had after that is the genesis of Fallout. But you would never have been able to plan for that. It was just a culmination of learning Super VGA, trying to make 3D engines, not being assigned to any one direct project so I could float, and learning a lot about how things worked on the other projects kind of gave me this insight into I could put together something here. So because of that, I like to think of Rags to Riches as like my first Interplay employee game and the game that directly led into everything I did after that. So I like that game. And I'm glad a couple people asked me questions about it because I haven't talked about it. And that's kind of its story.